The boy had fallen asleep in the passenger seat with his mouth open and his seatbelt twisted around his arm in a way that looked uncomfortable but clearly wasn't, because he didn't move once the whole drive home. Patrick Hollis carried him inside with one hand and used the other to push open the door, which still needed a new hinge, which had needed a new hinge for 2 years now, which he kept not getting around to because there was always something else first. He set the boy down on the couch and went back out to the truck. He sat in the dark for a few minutes without the engine running. The garage had been his wife's idea, originally, not the building itself. That had been there when they bought the property, a long, low structure behind the house with a leaking roof and a floor that smelled like decades of oil and winter. But the idea of using it, Claire had been the one to say it. She'd said it the way she said most things, not like a suggestion, but like something that had already been decided, and she was just telling him. You should use that building. You're going to go insane if you don't have something to do with your hands. She hadn't been wrong. She rarely was. That had been 6 years ago. 5 years and 4 months before she died. Patrick went inside and stood in the kitchen for a while without doing anything in particular, and then he put the kettle on and leaned against the counter and looked at the ceiling, which also needed work. Hollis Auto had no sign. This was a point of some mild amusement among the people in Dunmore who used it, which was essentially everyone who owned anything old or complicated or both. There was a hand-painted number on the mailbox at the end of the driveway, and a reputation that had been building quietly for the better part of a decade, and that was enough. Patrick had never seen much need for more. He'd spent 12 years as a senior powertrain engineer with one of the larger manufacturers. He knew engines the way some people know languages, not just the words but the rhythm underneath them, the way a sound could mean a dozen different things depending on what came before it. He'd given that up when Claire got sick, and then when she was gone, he'd found himself in a small town in Ontario with a 6-year-old son and a garage that smelled like oil and a set of tools he hadn't touched in almost 2 years. He started small, a neighbor's truck, the Anglican minister's ancient Volvo. Word got around the way it does in places like Dunmore, which is to say quickly and thoroughly and with significant embellishment. His son Eli was 7 now. He had Claire's eyes and Patrick's stubbornness, and a habit of dragging a small red toolbox out to the garage and arranging the contents by size, which was not how Patrick organized his tools, but which Patrick had never once corrected. It was a Thursday when the call came from the Bryce Merritt collection. Patrick was lying on a creeper under a 1971 Chevelle when his phone rang on the workbench, and he didn't answer it, and then it rang again, and then he heard Eli say from the corner of the garage, "Dad, your phone." "I know, it rang twice. I know that too." He came out from under the car. He looked at the screen. The number wasn't one he recognized, but the prefix was Toronto, and the name the caller left in the voicemail was one he did recognize, because most people in the province who paid any attention to classic automobiles recognized it. Bryce Merritt had made his money in construction and logistics, the particular kind of money that tends to accumulate quietly for 20 years and then announce itself all at once. He'd started collecting cars around the same time as the announcement. His collection now occupied a purpose-built facility outside of Barrie, climate-controlled, marble-floored, the kind of place that looked more like a gallery than a garage. Patrick had read about it once in a magazine at a dentist's office, and then spent the rest of the appointment thinking about it. The message was brief. A car wasn't running. Their regular service team hadn't been able to diagnose it. Someone had mentioned Patrick's name. Would he be available to take a look? Patrick played the message twice. He looked at the Chevelle. He looked at Eli, who had arranged 6 wrenches in perfect descending order on a rag, and was now contemplating a 7th. He called back. The facility was everything the magazine had suggested, and several things it hadn't. Patrick drove up on a Friday morning, Eli in the back seat, because school was closed. For some reason he'd been told and had already forgotten, and he pulled up to a set of glass doors that probably cost more than his house and sat there a moment before getting out of the truck. A woman in a fitted gray blazer met them inside. She introduced herself as Doreen Walsh, collections manager. She shook Patrick's hand with the efficient grip of someone who shook a great many hands and had long since stopped thinking about it. She glanced at Eli with a brief, calibrated smile. "This is my son," Patrick said. "He won't touch anything." "Of course," said Doreen. Eli said nothing. He had his hands in the pocket of his hoodie. He was looking at the cars. There were 31 of them, it turned out. A 1957 Ferrari 250 GT. A Jaguar E-Type in a shade of British racing green so deep it looked almost black in the gallery lighting. A McLaren F1 that Patrick had to make a deliberate effort not to stare at. Each car had a small placard with its year and provenance, the way paintings have labels in museums. The floors were pale stone. The lights were recessed and warm. The whole place smelled faintly of leather and something like money, which Patrick thought might just be what filtered air smelled like when the filtration system cost enough. The car with the problem was at the far end of the gallery. It was a 1969 Lamborghini Espada, burnt orange. The kind of orange that didn't ask permission. It was, objectively, one of the most beautiful things Patrick had seen outside of a photograph, and he'd spent most of his adult life around cars. "When did it last run?" he asked. 3 weeks ago, said Doreen. It started and ran for approximately 40 seconds, produced an irregular sound from the engine bay, and shut off. It hasn't started since. What kind of irregular sound? Our senior technician described it as a hesitation. A flutter, he said, like something catching and releasing. Patrick nodded slowly. He worked on it for a week, Doreen continued. His team ran diagnostics, replaced several components. Nothing. What components? She handed him a printed sheet. He read it. He read it again. They replaced the fuel pump, he said. Yes. And the ignition module. Yes. And they cleaned the carburetors. Twice, I'm told. Patrick folded the sheet carefully and put it in his jacket pocket. He looked at the Espada for a long moment. Eli had materialized at his elbow without making a sound, the way children sometimes do, and was looking at the car with the same expression Patrick recognized from mirrors. "It's orange," Eli said. "Yeah," said Patrick. "Like the cone on our driveway. A bit, but better. Quite a bit better, yeah." Doreen gave him access to the service bay, adjacent to the gallery, and left him to it. The service bay was immaculate. The tools were premium and plentiful and arranged with the kind of obsessive order that suggested either a very methodical technician or a very good organizational consultant. Patrick moved some of them to where he actually needed them and tried not to think about what the previous team had and hadn't done. He spent the first 2 hours just looking, not doing anything, just looking. Moving around the car, crouching, leaning, listening to the silence of an engine that wasn't running, and reading it the way you read a room when you walk in after something has happened. Eli sat on a stool with a juice box he'd found in his backpack and watched his father the way he often watched things, with total stillness and a quality of attention that was, Patrick had always thought, a bit uncanny in a 7-year-old. "What are you doing?" Eli asked after a while. "Thinking. You've been thinking for a long time. Some things take a long time to think about." Eli considered this. "Can I think too? You can try." The boy slid off the stool and walked around the car in a small, serious circle. Then he came back and climbed back onto the stool. "I think it's the orange part," he said. "Which orange part?" Ellie pointed at the engine bay, which Patrick had opened. "That one." Patrick looked. The component Eli was pointing at was the float bowl on the rear carburetor. It was, in fact, slightly orange, not by design, but because something had been seeping into it that shouldn't have been. Patrick was very still for a moment. Then he got his flashlight. The Espada's V12 used a set of 6 Weber carburetors. Triple choke, an arrangement that was either beautiful or maddening depending on your disposition, and how many hours you'd spent working on Italian engines from the late 1960s. Patrick had spent enough. He knew what properly balanced carburetors smelled like when fuel ran through them cleanly, and he knew what they didn't smell like, and what he was looking at now was the latter. The issue wasn't the carburetors. The issue was upstream of the carburetors, which was why cleaning them twice had done exactly nothing. The previous team had chased the symptom. Patrick had been looking for the cause. There was a secondary fuel line, a return line, technically, part of the original Italian engineering that had been slightly modified by a previous owner somewhere in the car's long history, and it had developed a failure in its internal lining that was intermittent, positional, and exactly the kind of thing that doesn't show up when the car is sitting still, but produces a distinctive flutter when fuel is moving through it under load. It was in its way elegant. The car had been telling anyone who was listening exactly what was wrong. It just required knowing what to listen for. He sent Doreen a text at 4:30 explaining what he'd found. He also called a supplier he knew in Hamilton who kept a stock of appropriate replacement line for older European cars. The part would be here by morning. Doreen texted back in 11 minutes. The text said, "Are you certain?" He texted back, "Yes." There was a pause, and then, "Our technician was here for a full week." Patrick looked at that for a moment. He wasn't sure what response was expected, so he didn't send one. He took Eli to a diner in Barrie for dinner because it was already past 6, and neither of them had eaten since the granola bars at noon. Eli had a grilled cheese and some kind of chocolate milkshake that arrived in a glass large enough to be structurally interesting. Patrick had the soup. "Did you figure out the orange car?" Eli asked. "I think so." "What was wrong with it?" "A small hose inside the engine. The lining had come loose." Eli thought about this carefully. "Like when my rain jacket lining came unstitched." "Exactly like that, actually." Eli seemed pleased to have the analogy confirmed. He went back to his milkshake. Outside the window, the last of the evening light was going off, behind a line of spruce trees, the sky turning the particular shade of October blue that Patrick associated with every autumn of his life, the specific color of coming inside. "Dad," Eli said, without looking up. "Yeah, are you going to fix it tonight?" "I'm going to try." The boy nodded, like this was the answer he'd been expecting. He picked up his milkshake glass with both hands. "I'll stay up," he said. "You'll fall asleep in the truck." "I won't." He did. He was out before they hit the highway, one hand curled loosely on his knee, the red toolbox he'd brought. Because of course he'd brought it, he brought it everywhere. Wedged between his feet on the floor. The part arrived at 7:15 in the morning by courier to the facility gate. Patrick had been there since 6. He'd slept in the truck for 3 hours and woken up cold and stiff and completely clear-headed in the way that only happens, in Patrick's experience, after exactly the wrong amount of sleep. He worked steadily through the morning, no music, no interruptions. Doreen arrived at 9 and stood in the service bay doorway for a few minutes watching him, and he was aware of her there but didn't acknowledge it. And after a while she went away. Removing and replacing the fuel return line on a 1969 Espada was not a straightforward job, largely because nothing about a 1969 Espada was straightforward, and also because the modification by the previous owner had introduced some non-standard routing that Patrick had to think his way around carefully before touching. He took his time. He was not the kind of person who hurried through things that shouldn't be hurried. By 11:30, the line was replaced. He'd also checked and reset the carburetor float levels while he was in there, not because they needed it. They were close, but because close wasn't the same as right, and he was here anyway. He primed the fuel system, checked his connections. Stewed back, he turned the key. The V12 started on the second crank. It didn't flutter, it didn't hesitate. It came up from silence in that particular way, that large displacement engines from that era do. A sound with weight to it, a sound that fills a room and keeps going. And Patrick stood there and let it run and listened for 30 seconds, a minute, longer, and there was nothing in it but the engine doing exactly what the engine was supposed to do. He let out a breath he wasn't entirely aware he'd been holding. Doreen appeared in the doorway again. This time she didn't stand there. She walked over to the car and stood next to Patrick and listened. "It's running," she said. "It's running." She was quiet for a moment. "Our team had it for 7 days. I know. You've been here since yesterday morning." "About that, yeah." She looked at him carefully. She was trying to determine something, he thought. The same thing people often tried to determine about him, which was whether his manner came from confidence or from something more troubling, and which was which. "Mr. Hollis," she said. "What was wrong with it?" He told her. He explained it the way he'd explain anything he cared about, which meant clearly and without condescension, but also without simplifying past the point of accuracy. Doreen Walsh, he noted, listened the way she'd shaken his hand, efficiently, retaining everything. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. "The return line," she said. "The return line. They never checked it." "They were looking in the right place," Patrick said. It was something he believed, more or less. They just stopped one step short. He billed for parts and labor at his standard rate, which was not, by any measure, the rate that a specialist facility in Barrie might have expected. He'd set that rate years ago and had never had a compelling reason to change it. Doreen looked at the invoice for a moment and then looked at him. This is your standard rate? She said. Yes, for everyone. For everyone. She studied him for a moment longer. Then she said, We have several cars here that have been waiting for attention. Our usual technicians are capable, but there are 2 or 3 vehicles in the collection that are beyond their experience. Patrick folded a rag and set it on the workbench. I have a garage in Dunmore, he said. About an hour south. I have other work there. I understand. But I could come up 1 Saturday a month, maybe, if the work is interesting. I imagine, said Doreen, with something that might have been the beginning of a smile. You would find it interesting. He drove home in the late afternoon with the windows cracked and Eli's empty juice box rolling around in the back seat, and the particular sensation he sometimes got after a job like this, not exactly satisfaction, or, not only that, but the older and quieter feeling of a thing done correctly, of a problem heard and answered in the language it was asked in. Eli was at the Gorman's place down the road, where Patrick had dropped him in the morning. He went and collected him around 5 o'clock. Eli was wearing someone else's hat and had a scraped knee and appeared to have had an excellent time without retaining any specific details about what had happened. In the truck on the way home, he asked, Did the orange car work? It did. Did you figure it out? Yeah, what helped? Patrick glanced at him. You pointed at something, he said. Eli looked out the window with an expression that didn't bother to hide how much he liked this answer. The orange part, he said. The orange part. They drove the rest of the way home through the long October light, past the farms and the rock cuts and the particular stretch of Highway 26, where the sugar maples in the median had all turned at once, a corridor of red and gold that lasted about 2 weeks every year, and that Patrick never drove through without looking. The door with the broken hinge was still waiting when they pulled in. The garage light was on. He'd left it on by accident, and the Chevelle was still half finished inside. Eli got out of the truck and went straight to the garage, and Patrick heard the familiar sound of the red toolbox being opened, the deliberate clink of tools being arranged. He stood in the driveway for a moment and listened to it. Then he went in to make dinner.